Um, Thank you. I want to thank all you guys for coming out today, and thank Leroy and the state of Minnesota for inviting me out and having me out here. This is my third event over the past couple of days. I was in Springfield and Sleepy Eye earlier. I met a lot of good folks and had a good time, so I'm sure the same will be the case here. I'm going to speak a bit and do some reading, but really I enjoy the most interacting with the audience and just answering y'all's questions. So feel free to interrupt me, and certainly at the end we'll chat as much as you want. I'm happy to give you guys as much time as you're willing to give me. But I'll go ahead and get started a little bit with. I like to start off by reading the preface, and some of you have a copy in hand, and you can follow along. That, as Leroy said, my goal here is to produce several volumes. The preface is the same in every volume, because it's more of a preface to the project and instead of being the preface to an individual volume. I just like to read it. It's not very long, and I just like to read it to you guys to kind of set the tone for what we're going to talk about later. America is a landscape shaped by journeys. The first North Americans likely walked here from Asia, whether hot on the trail of a woolly mammoth herd or merely enamored with the beauty of the rising sun, we will never know. Thousands of years later, new faces arrived from across oceans. Many pursued dreams, I think, familiar to us all: opportunity, freedom, community, peace. Others mounted a desperate last-ditch attempt to escape poverty, famine, war, the church, or the sheriff. Some disembarked in chains, forced ashore by those driven here by greed. A few, pining for adventure, just rolled the dice. From this foundation of human nature arose the United States of America, a nation shaped by ideals. I can scarce imagine an endeavor to equal the bold optimism so powerfully expressed on the eve of our birth. In truth, we have never perfectly honored the soaring faith in human potential and dignity enshrined in our founding documents. Nevertheless, I see the notion of America continuing to guide us while inspiring the world. Perhaps this is because we are still viewed as the place where ambition and ability matter more than pedigree. Or perhaps our formative values simply reflect the breadth of human yearning set forth on parchment. The ink has long since dried. Approaching 250 years old, what began as a framework of ideals has matured into a forum for ideas on how best to manifest those aspirations. We have emerged from a loose confederation of newcomers to become a people with a shared history and, most importantly, a shared future. Our collective journey continues. America is and always will be a work in progress. Where we come from is instructive. Where we stand is unclear. Where we choose to go is paramount. Conversations with Us is the story of my own journey into America to explore all of these and my mission to share with you what I have learned. I'm glad to have your company along the way. So, as we've talked about, Conversations with Us is really an exploration of America. And the first part of that was the means by which I explored America. And if you look, those of you who have a volume, if you look at the inside cover of your volume, you'll find this map right here. And it sort of shows how I set out to explore different regions of the country and how I sort of divided the country into regions to make them more manageable to explore, because I was exploring them 50 miles per day on a bicycle. And I would set out for about 5 weeks, 6 weeks at a time, with the goal of pedaling 50 miles a day and interviewing one person every day about their views on America. And the reason I chose that method was because it sounded cool. And the other one was because my bicycle, I thought, might serve as a conversation piece on wheels. Certainly when I was coming up to folks saying, hey, as Leroy mentioned, I'm traveling cross country interviewing folks for a book I might write one day. Would you be interested in chatting with me? Doing that from the saddle of a bicycle was a lot easier than, say, doing it from the window of a pickup truck. And folks were curious about what I was doing, and so they would ask me questions, and that was sort of an icebreaker of talking to folks. And so the logistical part, I think, is a story unto itself, and I'd be happy to share parts of that. But the real reason I did it, as we've talked about, and if you turn to the inside back cover of the volume you might be holding, was to find out what America means to the rest of America. And so this is a collage of everyone I interviewed, and it's about 375 people so far. And as Leroy mentioned, I've cycled 49 states. I still have Hawaii to go, and I do plan on flying out there and completing the project at some point. And, you know, I kind of, as we all know, everyone views the world a little bit differently. And I figured, you know, I value understanding what other people think, but even though I value that, I still don't really, you know, I still don't really avail myself of the chance of looking for that. I think like everyone else, it's just natural to fall into your rhythm, hang out with your friends, your family, and you don't, even if you value talking to folks who view the world differently or view the country differently, it's hard to do that unless you make it, you know, a deliberate endeavor. And most of us don't have the time. We might not have the health to get out there and travel to the other side of the country. Might not have the financial resources. And so, you know, after I graduated law school and had worked for a while, I thought, you know, it's kind of incumbent on me to do this. First of all, I'm curious. And I know that there are so many other curious folks, you know, who would want to know what, say, folks 2,000 miles away thought about a given policy, environmental protection, taxation, things like that, because there are regional kind of broad patterns, as we all know, and how folks kind of view the country and maybe, you know, governmental role and how the country works. And so I wanted to bring that back to folks who might not have the chance to do what I had the chance to do. And so if you look, you know, if you look, for example, on page 153 of the first volume, which is the Great Lakes States volume, you know, some of the folks I interviewed were just everyday people, like Rudy Nelson in Detroit. Rudy was a factory worker at Ford for, I think, 40 years or something like that. And I interviewed him at the local 503 Union Hall. And I asked Rudy, growing up in the Southeast myself, I didn't have a lot of experience with unions. I didn't know folks who were in unions. And so I asked Rudy, you know, what have unions done for the country? And he said, well, what was done for the members was done for the country. He said that I know especially in the black community, unions have really raised the standard of living for workers. He talked because his parents, like a lot of black folks at the time, had moved up from the South to work in factories in the North, and he said that he didn't see the kind of division among the working class that his dad had told him about existed in the South. And Rudy was 88 years old when I interviewed him, so he was, you know, working in the 40s, 50s, 60s. I also interviewed famous people. So if you look on page 172, you'll see a photo of Jackie Mayer, Miss America, I believe 1963. Jackie, I didn't know this at the time when I was interviewing her, before I started to interview her, but she had had a stroke, which left her speechless and partially paralyzed for several years as she recovered, and she had small children at the time. So she became sort of a spokesperson or advocate for stroke victims and sort of a comforter of stroke victims as she recovered. And so it's kind of a great dual story from her. What's it like to be Miss America, and then what's it like just to go through and recover from a serious stroke? And I did ask her at the end of our interview, well, what kind of advice would you give other pageant contestants? I had to ask that question. And she said, she actually thought about it for a while, and she said, be yourself and enjoy the moment and do your best. That's all you should ask of yourself, and that's all anybody else should ask of you. I also interviewed everyday people who found themselves enmeshed with nationally consequential events. When I was traveling through Kent, Ohio, you'll see a picture of Jim Zeller. It's a grainy picture because it was taken at night, page 185. I was talking to Jim, and then all of a sudden, his mood changed, and he said, talked about being a freshman at Kent State, and he said, I came out of class, and there was an Army sergeant standing there by the door with a machine gun. And of course, he had been present during the Kent State Massacre, which was a consequential event in our nation's history. And so that's some of the folks I came into contact with. Didn't have a famous title like Jackie did, but had witnessed and been part of these events in our history that most folks are aware of or should be aware of. I interviewed rich and successful people like Chris Whitman on page 246, an entrepreneur in Rochester. And she was a successful investor, an angel investor, a serial entrepreneur. And I think about Chris a lot because I asked Chris, what does it take to be a successful entrepreneur? And she said something that ended up being the title of that chapter. She said, you've got to be all in. So if you're have a startup company, etc., you've got to be all in. So as I'm writing my books with my publishing company, I think about that sometimes. Am I all in? I interviewed poor and desperate people. On page 159, I didn't take a picture of Paul, but Paul, I interviewed him right after Rudy. I found him at a bus stop in Detroit. He was a thin, young white guy. And I just started talking to him. I told him I'd like to hear some, I was traveling around the country looking for stories and perspectives from different places. And I said, what's going on in Detroit these days? I think that was my small talk way of starting the conversation. And he said, it's terrible. And it turned out Paul was a heroin addict. And he told me, told me about his situation, how he had to shoplift to buy drugs. He hadn't had anything to eat for 2 days. I gave him some of my trail mix. And, everyone, I think, if you talk to in depth someone, you will walk away with something from that person, usually. And I remember talking to Paul, and this is in the book, I shared this because I think it was an important lesson for me. I said, when Paul first asked me for money, I was trying to figure out, is this just, some panhandling junkie, or is this a person actually in need of help? And as I talked to him, I realized how stupid that had been. And I had not put the two together, that a person can be both. And that was an important realization for me. Because I had never been addicted to anything. Paul, I was able to open up and talk to Paul once I realized that in a more person-to-person way rather than be on the defensive. And he said at the end of the interview, I'd like for you to publish this conversation because if it helped even one person stay off of drugs, then it was worth it. I've interviewed, again, rich, successful people who are really, at the end of their rope. But I've also interviewed people who have been both poor and rich. Interesting fellow on page 34, you'll see Alan Childs. Not too far from here. I interviewed him on the Prairie Island Indian community up by Red Wing. And Alan grew up, he was a retirement age fellow when I interviewed him, and he grew up barefoot and hunting turtles and fishing along the Mississippi River. Didn't have electricity until he was 9 years old in 4th grade. And then he was going to school, his mother emphasized education. He took a math test and scored off the charts and ended up being a supervisor of the nuclear power plant that had been built up there at age 25. And then he retired at 40. And then the casinos came into the reservation there, and folks got a lot of money all of a sudden. And he said, I've lived poor, I live rich, I see the benefits of both. And so he had a really interesting perspective, as you might imagine. His mom and his aunts spoke, he called it Dakota Sioux, and he said they wouldn't teach it to him. Because they had been punished for speaking it, and so he never learned it. And they said now the children are learning it again. His generation sort of missed out on that. I also spoke with myself a lot on these tours. As you can imagine, as I'm riding, 50 miles a day or so, there's a lot of alone time. So you have a lot of time to reflect on folks I've spoken with and, try to process what they've taught me. And on page 133, I remember after I had spoken with an Amish man named Chris Eicher along the Indiana and Michigan border, I had been really curious as to why Chris chose to live the way he did, which is without electricity, without tractors. It's a tough life, and I was wondering, why didn't you just start using tractors and hook up your house to electricity? And so I just read you a little section here. Just a few hours after I talked to Chris, arriving in Concord, I circled around town a couple of times in hopes that something interesting would happen, but soon gave up and continued east along the Falling Waters Trail. Joggers, walkers, and cyclists were out enjoying the long summer daylight in a way that felt foreign to me, moving for the sake of movement itself, knowing exactly where they would sleep when they decided to stop. By reflex, my eyes began scanning the edges of the rail trail for a suitable camping spot. My thoughts, though, went back to Chris Eicher. I had essentially asked Chris why, given the hard work and tough lifestyle, he chose to be Amish instead of English. And you guys might know that the Amish refer to the rest of us as English. His response, "This is the only thing I know," laid bare a foundational assumption in my question I had been only nominally aware of until then. I subscribed wholeheartedly to the notion that we decide who we are. By extension, I had rarely questioned that we could one day up and choose to be someone different, or at least follow a different path if it suited us. From Chris's perspective, though, he didn't choose to be Amish any more than he chose his blue eyes. It was who he was, not something he could just change on a whim. I knew I would never abandon my visceral belief in our power to set forth and forge our identity and place in the world. Nothing is more foundational to the American dream. However burdensome, exciting, draining, empowering, and fraught with obstacles that path may be. But Chris and the barefoot children from the store taught me a lesson that day I let sink in. If I ever wanted to even begin to understand folks like them, I first had to consider that their range of choices might not be as broad as mine, their place in the world not as pliable. And so, as I mentioned, I spoke with myself and tried to kind of flesh out what these folks were trying to tell me, and what I could bring back to the readers who would one day, hear from Chris in that day. And you might imagine also that I was on the road for a cumulative 365 days, I think, so a cumulative year. And although my goal was to every day interview someone, there were some days when that didn't happen. And so the books are formatted with every day as a chapter. And so those days on which I didn't interview someone, they still appear in the book. And sometimes, I think in the first book, they're as simple as, I didn't interview anyone today. I washed my clothes and rested. And it's, because I didn't want this to be a fantastical experience. I wanted it to be to always remind the reader that this really happened. And life isn't always a party, even on a really cool bike tour. So I think I would like to read one or two more sections. In the second book, and this may be the case whenever anyone is doing something and they do it once and they do it again, you get a little bit better. And in my second book, I sort of let my imagination flow a little bit more, I think. And I'd like to read one passage from here that I really enjoyed writing. Some folks usually ask me how I met people to interview. And one of the ways I would meet people would be, for example, here, I knew I was going to be in Kingman, Arizona at some point down the road. And so I Googled Kingman, Arizona, and just looked to see what popped up. And one of the first things that popped up was the Kingman, Arizona Astronomy Club. And so I emailed the Astronomy Club, and I said, here's who I am, this is what I'm doing, like how I met Leroy when I emailed the library, or called the library. Would anyone like to chat with me? And the president, his name was also Chris, said, sure, I'll chat with you, just call me when you get here. And so I happened to arrive on Halloween, which also, this was the most wonderful serendipity, also happened to be the one Saturday night per month that the Astronomy Club has its star party, where a bunch of nerds get their telescopes and go out to a dry spot. I count myself among those nerds, by the way. A dry spot or a small spot in the desert, I think a 1/4 acre they had for this purpose, and they set up their telescopes and look at the sky and just chat about the heavens. And so Chris took me to that star party, and his telescope was so big it had to be loaded on a trailer. And so we went out there, we talked about Chris's, he was actually an electrician, we talked about that. But then, of course, once we got out into the field, there was just a big group of astronomers, so they just taught me everything they could teach me within 2 hours about the stars and different galaxies, et cetera, et cetera. And so I'm going to read you just the last part of this chapter. And this is once the night was over. We were latching the gate to Chris's trailer when another astronomer jokingly asked if I was disappointed because I didn't have a scary enough Halloween. I stood there on the dry dirt, blinking at the man, my eyes likely vacant, as the implications of what I had learned that evening began to crystallize in my mind. Overhead, the night engulfed us, its darkness pierced only by those pinpricks of blue-white light, able to endure millennia of lonely travel through the void of outer space. Whatever warm feeling I had experienced during those few hours of brotherly communion in the desert, whatever myriad pleasant moments I had yet to enjoy, would now sag under the heavy dread of knowing that Andromeda, an almost imperceptible, benign smudge above us, would one day collide with our own galaxy in a rolling cataclysm of destruction and rebirth. Beneath all of my future endeavors would now lurk the inevitability of our sun's eventual supernova and the resulting obliteration of Earth. Any satisfaction I might glean from my life accomplishments would hence come encrusted with the icy awareness of how that life, when compared to the infinite vastness of the universe, amounts to a period of time and breadth of existence so minuscule that our language doesn't even have a word to describe such insignificance. Not scary enough? That night under the stars will likely go down as the most terrifying Halloween of my life. And that was just something fun to write and to read. But I'd be glad to read another passage or to open it up for questions. I could kind of do both. Is there anyone that has any questions about anything I've said so far or anything I haven't said that they'd like to throw out right now?
I used to be a travel agent, and I did it for quite a while back in the days when free tickets were coming out of our ears. It was a great thing to do today. Not so much now. But so I traveled quite a bit, and after that ended, I traveled on my own dime. And it's always caught me off guard when I talk to people about they're going to this place, and I've been there too, what do you think? And they've got a whole different view than I did of that place. Often more negative. Oh, it was dirty, or there's nothing to do in Paris. Things like that. How can this be? And so do you, in the course of interviewing a drug addict in Detroit, were you able to get over the fact that Detroit, which I've been to a few times, is actually a pretty cool town, and there's lots to do. And my life wasn't governed by drug addiction, so I saw it differently. So I hope you didn't come out of this going, oh, I talked to this guy from Detroit, and therefore Detroit's a bad town. Were you able to supersede an individual's opinion about something?
Yeah, I rarely asked a person their opinion about the place where they lived. I was really much more interested in their opinion of America writ large. Regionally, for example, in this book, of course, this went through what's sometimes called as the Rust Belt. So there were a lot of economically depressed towns. But my real goal was to get a person, a Navajo person from northern Arizona's opinion on America writ large, and their community's role in that, and compare that to everyone else. So, yeah, I think that might be what separates this work from a travel log. I really wasn't exploring place as much as I was exploring people. And to me, I think your experience that you mentioned is so much, we conflate, for better or worse, our interactions with people in a place with the place itself. For example, here I've been walking down the sidewalk and people say hello on the sidewalk more than they do where I live in Virginia. And that makes me think that New Ulm is a nice place.
Good-looking people, too.
Yeah, well, that helps, too, yeah. I'm sorry, there's one depression here because of me, but when I leave, it'll go back up. But we do. It's always the people, and people always say, well, the people there are really nice. Anytime you ask, how's New Ulm, or how's, any place you ask, most of the time the response for a traveler, the people were nice, unless they were just going to see, some things like the Eiffel Tower or things like that. But that seems to be the most important thing in people's minds. Without even, I think, recognize it sometimes, how are my interactions with the people? In Paris, were the waiters rude? I think that really influences a person's view of the overall place. Because, and this is something I really learned, I remember specifically when I learned it in Yellowstone. In Yellowstone, there are a lot of foreign travelers, so it's an interesting place. One of the great gems of our country is our national park system. I'm sure folks know that. And foreigners, they talk about that all the time. And it's probably the best in the world. And I saw a lot of foreign folks and had the opportunity to interact with them. And I remember seeing one man was really upset because he couldn't get a picture of a certain waterfall because there's always people in his picture. And I thought, that might have been important for him, and I'm not poo-pooing his attitude, but I am saying that if you just wanted a picture of a waterfall, you can find that online. Really what you get out of national parks, if you allow yourself, is the interaction with the other park goers, or maybe with your family and friends who you came with. But the real opportunity there, on top of seeing the really cool stuff that we have and the beautiful scenery, and et cetera, is the opportunity to talk with someone next to you from, for instance, I interviewed someone from Switzerland. That's not a chance I get very often. And whenever I got those opportunities, I would always want to know, because my exploration here, my books are about Americans' view of our own country. But I would always try to take the opportunity when I came across a foreign person, what is your foreign perspective of America? I think that, it's always neat to see yourself through someone else's eyes. I think that's the best way to, frankly, grow and improve, and also feel good about what you're doing right. Long answer, but.
Did I miss it? You are an attorney now, and are you practicing law now?
No, I'm not. I'm not practicing law now. I'm kind of dedicating myself to writing and publishing. Yes, I left the practice of law to do the ride through the Great Lakes states, and I haven't been back since.
So your plan is to travel every state?
I already have. I've done all the cycling except Hawaii. So if you look at the inside cover of the front book, you'll see all the routes that I've already traveled. So I've traveled 16,000 miles, and this bag has been every one of them. That's why I brought it. I wasn't able to bring my bike today, but they call it a pannier, which I've been told comes from the French for like a breadbasket pan that they put on their bikes and carry the baguettes.
50 miles a day isn't very many miles.
Well, compared to what? I don't know. It's a lot of miles. It was plenty of miles for me. My project wasn't about making distance. It was about getting from one town to the next and finding someone new to talk to. And so each tour was about 1,800, 2,000 miles. On a 100-pound bike, made it a little bit longer too, harder too. Why the bike? I think I mentioned it was kind of my conversation piece on wheels. I liked the challenge of it. I liked the fact that it forced me out into the world. And frankly, making oneself vulnerable is a good way to meet people. I mean, I was at the mercy of every single person who passed me. And I could not hide. I could not, get hungry and tired and just go back in my room and close the door. It makes people, generally it would make people more open to talking to me. It made me less, I don't think I'm a very intimidating guy, but it made me more approachable, generally. I'm not sure if I was driving around in my truck that I would have the same experience. But I had plenty of people come up to me, women, men. My daughter-in-law traveled cross country by bicycle with her, with my son, and they had a great experience. Do you need a place to stay tonight? Are you traveling cross country? That happened all the time. And then I would sit down, and a lot of those experiences don't show up in the book, the books. And so, but I would sit down and I would have a formal interview that day, and then I would sit down with a random family at their dinner table and chat and see how they interact and learn that way. And that was just kind of more my time. That was really neat. And of course, I've probably slept in, 365 different places across the country, random places, and stayed in people's households that, didn't know me from Adam. And that was a really neat experience. And that was kind of my time to just relax and enjoy interacting with someone different than me.
What's the state of America?
Well, I think we all have the same opinion. I think it feels pretty divided. And I conceived this project 10 years ago, and it felt pretty divided then. And I think most people would agree, if not everyone would agree, it feels even more divided now. I don't know what to do about that, but one of the things that I have noticed during my travels is that we are probably the most diverse country in the world, and the diversity is wonderful, but it also creates a situation in which many of us don't have a shared experience. And I think lacking that shared experience is one of our biggest problems in this country. And I don't think that's being cultivated or sought, mainly for young people. And if anything's going to help our division, that would be it, or one of the things that would help. Having folks, you think about, I talk to guys, I talk to soldiers older, folks who said, I remember an older white gentleman from Oklahoma and said the first time he ever really spoke to a black guy was in the plane on the way to Vietnam. And 2 or 3 people told me similar stories. And, again, this is one of those situations that it's not like he refused to talk to anyone different from him. There just weren't many folks around his town, his little town. And that shared experience, and I think this happened a lot during the Second World War as well, that shared experience really opened a lot of eyes for the people who were forced into a situation together and relied on each other.
Just as far as the division in the country, for what it's worth, I think that's going to get better. It just needs a little time. But more importantly, when I first came down here, I was just going to pick up a book if I had no intention of staying. But after talking to you for just a few seconds, it's kind of like your travels, I'm sure, are interesting, but I'm more curious about you. This didn't just happen to start planning it 10 years ago. What was it like growing up? What were your parents like? What were your experiences that made you who you are and eventually did this?
Short answer is I don't really know. I think a lot of times we don't really know what drives us to do the things we do. I grew up in a middle class, maybe upper middle class household. My parents they both grew up really poor and became small business owners. They were opticians. And we in a kind of medium-sized town, and I don't see anything really remarkable about my childhood. If I were analyzing this from the outside, that would have driven me to do this. I think I've always just kind of been adventurous, frankly, and I've always liked, kind of been a little bit of a thrill seeker, and this was a thrilling thing to think about doing. I've always been really independent. I think that's just by nature, and this was, I was out there by myself. There was no one else with me, and it was just me and whoever would help me out and talk to me. I think I have a sort of strong sense of the way things should be and the way things should work, and I think that democracy should work and should be fair and open, and if people can respect the process, then they can accept the result of something they might not like if it was arrived at in a fair way. And if you read a lot of the founders' documents and letters, they gave at least lip service to that. And I think a lot of them believed in that, although some, were slave owners and so didn't manifest it in the way we would have had them do so. But that matters to me, and I think that I feel like this is, it's still the richest country in the world. And I think that, I think I never really understood, we all hear about the founders talking about, and Leroy was listening to me talking, and me and him had an hour-long conversation about a lot of this, so you feel free to come up here and speak with me, Leroy. And they talk about how America was a radical experiment, self-rule. And I never really, I kind of understood that, but I never really understood how radical our experiment was until, I think, doing this project. And even afterwards, because I've learned a lot just analyzing and thinking about the conversations I had, and how you get all these people with divergent interests to actually feel like they're united under a flag in a country. And that is a very difficult thing to do. A lot of other nation states are united based on a culture or a religion or an ethnicity, et cetera, or even a language. We are, the opposite of that. We are united by being different, which is such an, if you think about it, you would never think that would work. And I think what's happening is we're just not putting in the work we need to make that work. And I've found that, when you look at history, the worst things happen when one person doesn't view another person as a person. I think we're all tribalistic by nature, and maybe it's an evolutionary thing. I think we like to be with, our group and kind of exclude other folks, and sometimes, again, by default, maybe view them less than our group. And the broader we can extend those borders of our group, the broader out in the country, the more we will be likely to accept someone's different views. As long as they're still one of us, and as long as we all feel American and the same kind of, same valued the same in America, we can accept disagreements. Just like you might have a good friend, you guys could argue a lot, but you still trust each other. And that's what we need. And I didn't really see anyone doing that. I got really frustrated. I think going to law school awoke some of this as well. Frustrated seeing the way the media stokes those divisions for ratings, and it happens on both sides. And it's sad to me because people buy into it. And as Leroy and I were talking this morning over coffee, political parties are going to exist because you have people with different interests. Rich people, poor people, people with lots of land, people without much land. But now you see parties defining themselves based on ethnicity and identity and skin color and things like that. And those are things you can't, this is a point that Leroy made this morning, those are things you can't change. Where you have economic divisions, those, that's fluid. It can be fluid. It should be fluid. But now it's just become an identity or a culture war kind of thing, an identity war. And that will never be resolved. And it's just easier than going through the hard work of making, I think the best policy for tax policy for the next 10 years is this, or I think we should socialize medicine, or I don't. Those are policy discussions. And that should not be a visceral, unbridgeable gap like, well, I'm from the South and you're from the North, or those things you can't change. I'm rambling a little bit, but the goal of the project is for us to see each other as human beings, and so I was able to do that when I stayed with people who I disagree with politically often, and almost always it was okay. Very few times any of us got mad with each other, and I was actually just incredibly surprised by how easy it was. And you'll see in some of the interviews, I challenge people directly. There's one in here that comes to mind, a man in Pennsylvania, Gordon Pettit, in Pennsylvania. I think it was in this one. I challenged him a lot about his views on OSHA or the EPA. And we had a great conversation. And it was him and his wife who were all talking. And none of us got mad. And I said, well, what do you say to people who believe this? And I learned a lot. Excuse me if I take a sip of water here. What happens when you talk nonstop? I remember, I view global warming as a serious threat to quality of life, personally. I've studied the environment in college. I've seen the science. I've seen glaciers melting back all over this hemisphere. But some people disagree with me. And I was in eastern Kentucky, which is coal country, and I think it was Hillary Clinton during the presidential debates said something like, "We're going to shut down coal and we're going to get clean energy." And for my years before conversations with us, that's like, oh, that's a great idea. I support that, and I still support clean energy. But I was talking to these guys in this cafe, and what they hear when they hear Hillary Clinton or anyone else say, we're going to shut down coal and move to clean energy, is, we are coming here to destroy your way of life. And I never really thought about that before talking with these guys in Western West Virginia. Had a really good interview with a former Marine and his co-workers in the cafe. But, to sort of be empathetic, but to understand the way you think about things or the way you say things, how people who are on a different side of the country might hear that. And I'm not speaking about rhetoric. I'm not speaking about messaging. I'm speaking actually thinking about how your policy is going to affect these people and include some sort of mitigation factor. I mean, maybe she should have said, we need to move to clean energy and help the folks who rely on coal to make a living find other ways to make a living. If she had said it that way, it may have gone over a little bit better in Kentucky and West Virginia. But not just saying it in a certain way, but actually for us, the readers and everyday folks, to take these other folks into account. You still don't have to agree with folks. I'm not trying to say that, but at least see that probably most of the time, whatever view they have is coming from the same place our views are coming from. A desire to live well, protect our family, have a good place to live for our children, etc. Even though they may be fundamentally wrong in some cases, and in other cases, they just view things differently.
Are you planning to get into politics, or are you halfway there now?
No, I don't want to. I don't think I could do that, especially not in the current environment where I think it's just maybe local or something, but I don't have any plans to do that. You know, was it Churchill? Leroy might know this, or said that a population gets the leaders it deserves. In a democracy, basically the citizenry gets the leaders it deserves. And so if we aren't paying really close attention, if we aren't educating ourselves, if we aren't looking to overcome our own biases, if we aren't allowing our gut to say, I like this person, and then saying, okay, my gut said that, what does my brain say? Does it agree with my gut, or am I being a little too emotional with this vote? If we're not doing that, then we're going to get the leaders we deserve, which I think generally aren't going to be good leaders. If we're not taking our democracy, people talk about the vote. The vote is important, but it's a lot more than that. And, you know, the founders, I think, set the country up with the idea of folks taking it seriously and kind of trying to educate themselves on things to the extent possible. I mean, sometimes you don't have time. I mean, we don't have time to educate ourselves on everything. So sometimes you have to kind of rely on your view of the candidate's character. But we need to take it seriously and hold people to account. And I just don't see a lot of that going on right now.
What are your plans for the future once you're done with this project?
I don't really have any. It's going to take me a while to get all the books written and published, and so we'll just see what happens after that. I'm writing a fiction book for fun. That may be published one day, but yeah, I'm not really looking too far into the future right now. So we'll see.
I kind of envy you on the convention that you're doing. I've been in over 40 states, but I didn't go around with a bicycle. But if I was doing what you are doing or trying to do, I would appreciate myself being alone more than trying to look for people to converse with and place them enjoying the scenery and all that sort of thing. I would hate to be pedaling along and just come 3-4 people I want to spend 2 hours talking to me. I'm not built that way. Just everybody's different.
Well, it wasn't always easy. I mean, I think I am somewhat outgoing, but yeah, I mean, I felt like I was working most of the time. I mean, I was putting in 14-hour days between pedaling, trying to find a place to sleep, finding folks to interview, updating my website and things. I mean, it was a lot of work. I was exhausted at the end of 5 or 6 weeks. But you know, what kept me going was really thinking about my future readers. I did not want to miss an opportunity to interview someone, thereby doing my future readers a disservice. And so that was kind of the motivating factor for me. I mean, myself learning and having these experiences was part of it, but a lot of it was also focused on what do I owe my future readers. I did view it as a job, and I did take it really seriously.
But I think that's the uniqueness of individuals. You know, you are an adventurer. We all are destined for something, but I like hearing you tell that you like to hear the stories of what makes America.
And so, yeah, I appreciate that. And so when I say stories, my interviews would sometimes go every which way, because most of the folks I talked to weren't planning on being interviewed that day. But I was definitely trying to focus on I would ask questions like, what changes are you seeing? What changes would you like to see? What changes would you not like to see? Where do you see us in 20, 50 years? What is your American ideal? What's your view of the American ideal? Have you encountered any unfair obstacles? I mean, we all encounter obstacles, but have you had a fair chance at fulfilling your potential was a question I like to ask. And because I really wanted to get, like, talking to all these different kinds of folks and getting their perspectives, like, how would you construct America from scratch based on these people's ideals of what it should be? And how, certain folks, talking to folks, for example, in the Southwest, Native folks, it was interesting hearing their perspective on things, which I don't get in the Southeast very much. And yes, that just happened all over the place. And seeing, like, is in fact the American ideal attainable by folks in different parts of the country and different races, different anything. And even if it is attainable, do they feel like it's attainable? Because that's really one of the most important things, I think, about pursuing the American dream, is to first feel like you have a fair shot at making it if you try. And if you don't have that idea that, yes, I can be successful if I work hard, then you'll never even get started.
What was that last statement?
If you don't have a notion, if you're not grounded in a notion that, yes, if I work hard, I have at least a good, fair chance of being successful, then you'll never even get started trying to do anything with your life. And I think that's as far as, personal development, or that notion is what is lacking in a lot of folks today. And that's what we need on the individual level, is for folks to really believe in that notion, and for it to be true, in fact, that everyone has a fair shot. And that really is the American ideal, I think, in a nutshell, that everyone has a fair shot of fulfilling their potential. Not that everyone will, get a participation trophy. Some people aren't going to make it. But the people who don't make it should still be able to support themselves and, be able to feel like they had a fair shot, have in fact had a fair shot, and still not be left destitute. Any other questions?
What was the average age of people that you've invited?
That's a good question. It sometimes depended, but I think, I haven't actually gone through and looked, but I feel like it was older, an older group, because just by default, older folks were more available to chat. For example, in the first book, I interviewed, I think, 3 teachers, which is more, out of the 35 or 38 people I interviewed, it's whatever percentage that is, there's not that many teachers compared to other occupations, but it happened to be that I was touring in the summer. And so they were off work, and so they were easy to come into contact with. So when I wanted to be random in my interview selection. Sometimes, like the astronomer, I would look for different kinds of folks I hadn't interviewed yet. And sometimes, in person, I would also, I just interviewed, say, 3 women in a row. I really should interview a man this time, or an older person or a younger person. I think the hardest group of people for me to get to contact with were rich people, to be frank. And so it was a treat to interview Chris Whitman. But if I left anyone out, I feel like it was, very wealthy people who are Americans just like everyone else, and their perspective matters too. It does. So. Any other questions? I could talk all afternoon long. Or if you guys might want to hear anything else from the books, or any logistical questions. I haven't heard many of those, like how it all worked, or.
Did I hear you say you haven't been to Hawaii?
Have not. No.
Are you going?
I am. I'd like to fly out there, and it's going to be a logistical challenge to get the bike from island to island, but I'd like to go out there and hit 3 or 4 islands if I can. Yeah, spend a couple weeks. Alaska was an interesting one. I flew into Juneau, biked maybe 70 miles or something, and then got on no, that's not true. Biked in Juneau, I got on a ferry to Haines, Alaska. And then I'm not sure if folks are familiar with Alaska geography, but if the big old, shoulder of Alaska that sits on Canada, and then there's Canada like this, and here's Alaska over here, and then down here is Juneau. And so there's 2 sections of the state that aren't connected to one another. They're connected through Canada. And so I take a ferry up to Haines, and then there's 300 miles, 350 miles of Canada, and then you're back in Alaska again. And so I hitchhiked 300 miles on a trailer. It was a family of motorcyclists, and their parents, like brothers, were driving a truck with a trailer in the back in case anyone broke down. And I walked up to a gas station. I was about 60 or 70 miles into Canada, and I said, there was nothing between where I was going in Tok, Alaska. And I said, could you guys carry me back into Alaska? I'd rather not be by myself for a week in the Canadian wilderness. They did.
Plenty bears.
Yeah, I definitely passed several bears, moose. I had a moose cow walk right beside me in Denali. That's on video, actually, on my website, National Park. So I guess I should say that, talk about the books. There are a few left for sale. I like physical books. There are ebooks available on my website. I have cards here and cards back there. The ebooks are available on Amazon too. You can order them from my website. You can order, if you don't have an ebook reader, you can also order a PDF copy, which is actually looks very good on a computer screen or a larger tablet. And there's no formatting issues. It's clean and it's nice to read. On my website as well, you can download those. And the cool thing about the ebooks is they have hyperlinks that you can click, and it'll bring you like that video of the moose. I haven't written the Alaska volume yet, but for example, it would be in the ebook where I talked about encountering a moose and then filming it, and then you would click the link and it would bring you to the video. And one cool thing I think is cool, Leroy's been dealing with books for a long time, so he can tell me. It's an idea I came up with. So when I formatted the second book for an ebook, everyone knows what a hyperlink is. There's a block of text, and a hyperlink is blue, and then when you click the blue, it takes you to whatever website they want you to take you to. Well, I left the links blue, or the text blue, in the print book. So if you buy the print book, there's a page, kind of a hidden page on my website that the address is here, and you can pull that up on your computer screen, and as you're reading, you'll see some blue text in here. For right here, example, it says, this is a chapter I thought about reading you guys, but it says, out on the hostel's front porch, an hour or so before dusk, a reclining wooden chair hugged my bottom while a handrail supported my feet. And handrail is in blue. And so if you go on the website, you'll look for, there's a big group of videos and pictures. You look for the one that says handrail underneath it, and you'll see a picture of my feet up on the handrail that I took, but I couldn't include it in the book because I didn't want the book to be so full of pictures. But I thought that was, I call it analog hyperlink. And I've never seen anyone do it, so I'd be thrilled to see what you guys think about it. Like here is painted distant mountaintops and race to the bottom. Those are videos that are, if you look on that web page, you'll actually see these videos of what I'm talking about here. Of course, you can't put a video in a book. Some of them are pictures as well, and it just kind of adds to the experience. And there's some audio as well, and it's kind of a multimedia experience from the book that you can also get from the ebook. I try to take 3 pictures a day, because it's not something like this, you can get kind of overwhelmed with taking pictures. So I try to limit to 3 a day. One was a picture of the person I interviewed. One was a picture, and this is my favorite, I think, of all, of the bike in front of something from that day. So Great Lakes States is in front of Niagara Falls. This, of course, is on the lip of the Grand Canyon. And then the third picture I would take every day was just anything random I wanted to. So it could be anything, an animal I saw or whatever. And that was on Instagram. On Facebook were these pictures. But if you guys, once you read the books, I've got, I think, all 4.5 or 5-star reviews on Amazon. There just aren't very many of them. So even though you didn't get the book on Amazon, you can always, if you have an account, go on Amazon and leave a review. And that would really help me a lot. Leave a review on Goodreads, which would be great. Or you can just tell your friends and family and folks on Facebook about the project, and you can tag me with @conversationswithus. And that would be really cool. To help me get the word out.
So right now you have two different books out.
Yes, ma'am.
How many do you think you're going to have when you finish?
So hopefully it's going to be 8. And so the way I've done it, if you look at the back of the second book, I put a mock-up of all the different covers. So because Alaska was a small tour, I've combined it in a volume with what I call Big Skies and Rocky Mountains. And so that'll be one volume. And then the last book will be Hawaii, and it'll be combined with the Deep South. The Deep South was actually my first tour, but I did it so long ago that I decided to start the series with my second tour. So the first book is the Great Lakes States. And what I'm going to do is, my idea is to take my motorcycle, I have a touring motorcycle, and retrace my deep south route for about 2 weeks and sort of compare and contrast what's changed, what hasn't changed about the South in the 10 years that are going to separate the two tours, and then make that a single volume, combining it with Hawaii, but that will be a single story, like weaving the two tours together to bring the old tour back into relevance.
I'm a motorcyclist as well, and weather is a big deal on a trip. Did you encounter some crazy weather on your rides?
Yeah, you can imagine I did. What just immediately comes to mind is I was on the top of a mountain in West Virginia during a thunderstorm, which is a really bad idea. And a lightning bolt hit the cow pasture 100 yards from me or something. It almost knocked me off my bike, not with the force, but just the sound and the being scared. I mean, it rained all the time on that tour through the Appalachia. In the West, I was afraid of tornadoes and things, and just big weather. I got hailed on. Of course, the heat was a big factor in the Southwest, but also I remember going through Missouri, riding my bike down the road. I'd ride over a patch in the road, and I'd leave a tire print in it. That's how hot it was. Yeah, I distinctly remember that. Yeah, so weather, of course, is part of the story every day. There were very few days when weather was kind of in the background. I mean, it was always there. Very few days where it's just totally, you don't even think about it because it's so pleasant. Wind is a huge factor. You don't think about driving your car, but riding through North Dakota, I was riding against the wind, and it would cut my speed in half easily. It's a good question. Yeah, so I was always really tired, and so I didn't want to spend a lot of time with the bike every day. But I had a rule where once a week I would go through, tighten all the screws, lubricate the chain, lubricate the pedal clips. I learned the hard way that so folks might know that you might say a more advanced pedal is a clip, and you have clips on the bottom of your shoes. And I had shoes that had recessed cleats, and so they looked like normal shoes. I didn't walk around like the racers do like this. But it had recessed cleats that would then clamp into the cleat, and you could get both a push and a pull motion because you're clamped in. But they're supposed to be easy to move out. But they're only easy to move out if those cleats are clean and lubricated. I learned that the hard way when I fell down, and I saw that I'd been on the bank, I'd camped on the banks of the Mississippi down in Louisiana, and everything had got full of sand. And I learned I needed to start cleaning these things out with a toothbrush. Generally, maintenance wasn't a big deal. I had to replace my entire drivetrain in Appalachia because it had just worn out. My chain had stretched so much, it was off the calipers at the bike store. They couldn't measure the stretch. And going up, Appalachia is a bad place to have your chain skipping over your sprockets. And it was pretty hard. So I changed it out as soon as, I had to order it at one bike store, and I couldn't wait for 3 days. And so I just pedaled with bad drivetrain for 2 or 3 days, and they had it sent to another bike store. And I got there, and they swapped it out. The basic maintenance, yeah, and I did all the swapping everything out. I wish I could have had my bike here. There's only one, other than the frame, there's only one thing that's original on the bike when I bought it. And surprisingly enough, it's the front rim. But that survived 16,000 miles, and it still survived. Everything else has been swapped out, either from braking or from upgrading or trying different things. I'd always make sure my brake pads I would swap them out after several tours because they wear out quick because it's a heavy bike. And I was pushing, I'm maybe 175 plus 100 pounds, 275 pounds. And so that, wears out things. I had an aluminum rack brake so I got a steel rack after that. I stuck with steel. But I never had any major issues, luckily. I mean, I guess the drivetrain was major, but I never had any really dangerous issues or got stuck for a long time somewhere.
How many flat tires?
That's a good question. I actually kept track. In the Southwest, it was one every day at least because of thorns and we call them sand spurs. They call them goat's heads in the Southwest, and in Texas they call them stickers. But they're basically spiky balls that are the bane of every cyclist. But I think I ended up with 42 flat tires over the whole trip. I got smart. It took a while, but I got invested in some good tires by a company called Schwalbe, and they're very resistant to puncture. A lot of people are using tubeless tires now, and again, I can talk to you guys all day about equipment, but I had tube tires, but Schwalbe's. I actually remember the day after I interviewed you, Leroy. I think that's the picture in this book. Remember I told you I took a picture of whatever sometimes? Was this giant, there it is right there, a giant thorn sticking through my tube, inch-long thorn. And then I changed it, got to the gas station across the street, and something had sliced the tire open in a block and a half, a piece of metal or something. I had slime, and slime was just pouring out. So I had to change that tire. It was a challenge, yeah. And I carried a spare tire with me that I had to swap out at the Grand Canyon, a folding tire, not just a tube, but an actual tire. I carried that with me as well. And I had to use it in the Grand Canyon. I had to use it at a bike. I had to buy another tire. So tires, people think about pop tires, but you don't think about tires actually wearing out and getting bald. So I would only get, I think, 2,000 miles out of a tire or something. Well, any other questions? Any final thoughts, questions? Like I said, I've got a few books left back there for anyone who might want to purchase one. If you want, I don't send out emails hardly ever, but if you'd like to be on the email list to see when the third one's coming out, you can sign up back there. You can find me on Facebook. I'm not active at all. I'm terrible at social media. But check out, not that much, not as much as I should. Check out my website. And like I said, yeah, tell your friends. I've found that I really connect with individuals. I don't do good on social media and things like that, and people trust what their friends and family say. So if you're interested and you like what you read, tell your friends, and they can find me on my website, order books on my website, and I'd be happy to send them. And I believe you said your grandson, for example, was a cyclotourist or an adventurer at least. You can go on my website, order a book, and say, send this to my grandson, and write from your grandma, and I'll do that. I'll get a book, write it, whatever you want, and send it to, or get my publicist to send it to someone. So.
Thank you very much, Chris.